Good morning. So I think this is very interesting, right? So we have spoken about insurance and most of the places that we were talking about the data exchange. And I give you a real example. I think all of you must have experienced. I just recently renewed my car insurance, right? And while I have taken the car insurance from one insurance, right, I had a proposal from most of the insurance companies. And it has all the details, right? The car registration number, your model, IDV, and all the information. So that's where, right, you don't know, right, how the data has been exchanged. So that's where probably I think insurance will also go through the process of the DPDPA, and I'll touch upon, so Digital Personal Data Protection Act, I think most of you must be aware, which has already been passed as an act in Parliament 2023. Now the draft rule has come in the February 2025 and is just waiting for the implementation guidelines to come, right? But just will walk you through the process. I know in 30 minutes, it's very difficult to cover such a vast topic, but I'll just try to touch up with points. I'll just skip few of the things. Okay, so let's look at that. I think Samir has already spoken about lots of the transformation which is taking place in the insurance, right? So I'll not try to dig too deep into that, but I'll just touch upon some of this point to set a context for the DPDPA, right? So I think you look at it, that entire the operating model of insurance is changing, right? Primarily, if you look at it, demand for instant onboarding, right? Quick disbursement, seamless distribution, right? You are able to renew the insurance on fly, right? People are looking for the real-time underwriting claims, and I think this has been primarily led to the adoption of the deep technology within the insurance companies, right? So for example, mobility, right? You can, or the use of the APIs, use of the AIML in the process of underwriting and all. So these are the technology has been transforming that entire the process of the insurance. Look at the scenarios where that in the context of how the data gets exchanged, right? And that's where the entire the context of the DPDPA comes. And I'll touch upon the DPDPA on the subsequent slide. In case of the bank insurance, like primarily where the bank is leading the entire the sales process, selling an insurance as whether it's selling the saving account or say for example home loans, during that process that the insurance gets sold out, right? And then lots of the data gets collected and shared with the insurance companies, right? But at that time customer is not having a clarity that he is giving a consent for insurance, but is it to the bank or is it to the insurance company? Lots of the challenges will be there. And also, as we was talking about, lots of examples of that, how the things are moving on the embedded insurance, right? Now you go to the Make My Trip, you're booking a ticket, flight ticket, you get an insurance, you're buying any stuff on Amazon, you can see that at the checkout stage, you can buy an insurance, right? There again, also that the entire the data exchange is taking place. But where the consent are being captured, are the customers aware about that, whom that they are giving the consent? Those all the scenarios are there. Between the third-party platform and embedded. And these are all challenges, if you look at it, where the data securities are there, right? Where the consent ownership, where the purpose is getting mapped to that process. And then audit trails, like where the consent has been taken. Is the consent has been taken on the aggregator platforms or, say, for example, bank platform? Is that consent has also been passed into the insurers where that in the insurance system that consent has been captured? So these are some of the challenges you will see. Then contractual ambiguity, like who is a data fiduciary and data processor? So if you look at it from the DPDPA perspective, data fiduciary is the entity who is managing the data, but at the same time who is deciding the purpose of the data which is getting collected, right? That's a very simple definition for the data fiduciary. And data processor who is acting in behalf of the data fiduciary, right? So typically in all the cases of insurance, the insurers is the data fiduciary, right? So who is the data fiduciary? Customer may not have that clarity. And then interdependency across the partner technology systems and all these things. Few of the changes, I'll not talk about deep into that, again, because Samir has already spoken most of the things. I think policy-centric to the experience-centric, where the things are changing, where that primarily you are at a particular place, you are doing the transaction, and during the process, you are able to buy the insurance, right? And, or say, for example, now moving from the agent-led and branch-led sales to the entire embedded process, right? As I was giving the example like Amazon, if you're buying in a phone, you may be able to buy the insurance also during that process, right? So that's the whole process is changing within the insurance. Then static process, though real-time usage-based. We were talking about the telematics, use of the telematics or the wearables, where that the entire the data, which is other than that what you call is straight personal data, right? Those are the data is getting collected and being used to help you to decide the pricing, like the pay per use, the way you drive your car, how long you drive your car, those all the informations are available. Now these informations are being used to decide your pricing for the insurance, right? And the paper-based claims to the tax and all these things, right? You can take a snapshot, take a pictures, and then send it, and then things are moving where that the AI-led claim processing can happen. So these are the scenarios. That's why I just wanted to give a context. And the previous what Samir has spoken about, in the context, like look at the DPDPA. But before that, many of you may be aware of the whole of the concept behind the DPDPA, but I'll just touch upon a few minutes. From the DPDPA perspective, you look at who are the critical component to the process, right? I think first thing is not covered, which is more important, the data principal. Who are the data principal? All the, us as an individual who is buying that, and then we are giving certain of the personal information, right? It could be the name, your identity card, your address proof, your financial transactions, all sorts of information where that I own the data and I have given the data to you, right? You might have generated, but still I have an ownership of that data. That's where the data principal comes into the picture. The data fiduciary, I already spoken about. The data fiduciary are the entity who is collecting the data for the data principal like individual, but primarily deciding the purpose, that why the data is getting collected. He takes a call. Like in the case of the bank, if he's giving a home loan, bank is deciding the purpose of the data to process the home loan. And the same way it goes for the insurance also. I think there is also term has been introduced, significant data fiduciary, which is primarily as per the Act definition. If you look at it, any entity which will be processing the large set of the volume of the data, the criticality of the data, but it has not defined that which kind of the entity is falling into the significant data fiduciary. We are awaiting that, I think, final guidelines, implementation guidelines to come, which will suggest. Largely, it is anticipated that banks and insurers will fall into the significant data fiduciary. There are some additional responsibility have been laid down for the significant data fiduciary, like, say, for example, performing the data audits. They need to do the complete detailed impact assessment of the data that is getting collected. I think consent manager, this is very interesting. So what the Act also introduced, like if you look at the DPDPA, entire thing is being centered around the taking the consent. Having the right auditable consent for that customer to collecting the data and then using the data for that particular purpose. Now, typically, what I suggest that there has to be some kind of the entity which is collecting the consent on behalf of the data fiduciary. Many of you may be able to correlate with the account aggregator. How many of you have used account aggregator? I think most of you would have tried with account aggregator, right? Account aggregator is in a real terms, if you look at it, a consent manager, which works on behalf of the banks or the insurance or AMC, taking a consent of the customer to collect the data and share with the person who want to use the data, right? So that's where that it has been introduced. While it has talked about a consent manager, it has laid down the process that primarily once the data protection board comes into the picture, they will decide that who can operate as a consent manager. So what will happen, the scenarios, when you are building in a customer journey where that you are going to collect the data, you will be primarily using the consent manager to record the consent part. Then data protection officer, this is again primarily is going to be applicable to significant data fiduciary. This entity has to appoint a dedicated individual who is reporting to the senior management as well as the board, who will be responsible for driving that entire the privacy and governance culture within the organizations. And then also it's talk about the setting up the data protection board. Data protection board is nothing but primarily a regulatory entity who will be responsible for ensuring the compliance with respect to DPDPA across all the entities, right? And then last not the least, but the data processor. So data processor is again going to be the entity which is primarily going to process the data. So either data fiduciary themselves may be directly processing the data, or they may be using the data processor, right? It could be SaaS-based platform, it could be your broking firms, it could be your partner, aggregator, it could be anybody can be fall into data processor. Why it is very critical? Because all the responsibility of the DPDPA, as it will lies with the data fiduciary, it will also be lies with the data processor. So they will have to primarily ensure that all the compliance requirement has been taken care. So few of the critical principles from the DPDPA, if you look at it, one is the lawful processing and consent. So whatever the data that you are collecting, there has to be a lawful reason. I think in case of insurance, banking, and all this thing, that's very sorted, right? We are not doing any illegal activities. But it need to have a very clear consent. So today, if you are taking any data for the insurance, and then by default, there is an embedded purpose has been taken into, like, for example, you will using the consent for the marketing and offer, that may not work, right? So that's one of the things. And the notice. So every time you collect any sort of the data for any particular, with consent, you have to send a notice to the customer that he has given the data. And when you talk about the notice, it has to also define that what the notice need to cover, that what data has been collected, with whom the data is going to be shared, what is the purpose that data has been given, where that he can go and raise any grievances, or say, for example, he want to withdraw the consent, there should be a mechanism that he can reach out. So those all the dynamics has been put in place and expected to be laid down by the data fiduciary. I think purpose limitation very clearly. Once the data collected, it can't be that you just run around and serve for all the purpose, right? So say, for example, if you are collecting a location-based data, there has to be very clear purpose linked to the data collections based on the locations. If you have collected the data for the selling of the insurance, you can't use for the marketing and advertising. But yes, if you want to take the data and you want to use for the marketing, you have to take a specific consent with the customer, right? So these are the scenarios. Then data minimization, this is again very clear. If you can't map the data which is getting collected to the purpose, for the processing of the purpose, you need to go back and look at the data that you are collecting. So this is again going to be very critical. Then ensuring the accuracy of the data across all the platforms with a processor, everything is correct. If the customer comes back and update a particular data, then it should be updated across all your systems. I think storage restrictions, one is that data localizations, that data need to be stored in the country, security control need to be there, accountability, so entire liabilities will be with insurance as expecting because of the data fiduciary nature. I think lots has been emphasized that it has to entire the data which has been laid down, strong data security standard that need to be followed, be it on encryption, audit logs, and all the aspects, right? And the last, not the least, what other thing is the data protection, impact assessment, and data audit. These are the responsibility going up for the significant data fiduciary. So what it says that what are the way you may be doing the risk assessment within the organizations, right? Typically, you do the self-control risk assessment. Similar way, this is the exercise has to be done, that what are the data is getting collected, what are my risks are there, what are the privacy issues can happen, and then accordingly significant measures that you are taking up. And then you continue to perform the data audits. Any questions so far? Yeah. So let's continue a little more deeper. So consent must be free, specific, informed. Yeah, please.
Shashank, how does one enforce purpose limitation?
Sorry?
How does one enforce the limitation of purpose?
Okay, so that's where that you are going to figure it out, right? When you are collecting the data, where that you are taking a consent, you need to specify that for what purpose, right? You need to define it. Let's say, for example, for the insurance, you will have to define it that the data is getting collected to issue an insurance. I'm not talking about a real language you need to work it out. And during the processing of the claims, and then also you may have to suggest that with whom the data will be shared with, like say, for example, partner in hospitals and all these things. So you'll have to define that. Is it for health insurance, life insurance, right, motor insurance? Very clearly purpose has to be defined. So as I said, it need to be very explicitly stated. So you can't, if you are selling the product, then purpose has to be linked to the product. Notices, when you are sending the notice, then you need to communicate that with whom all it can be shared, right? So those are the specification has to go in the notice. You may not define it in the detail, everything is the consent in the journey forms, right? So marketing or analytics and all this thing, you just need to take in a specific consent. So you may have, like, say, for example, multiple options, multiple data consent opt-in options, and where that you define each purpose separately. So you can't be in a bundle consent with a multiple purpose defined, and it's just a one single tick. one of the critical things that you will have to ensure that all are not opt-in, right? Typically, you will go and find out that okay, everything is already ticked in. But you need to give an option to the customer to tick in. So it's typically like opt-out situations would be there, and he should be able to tick in. One of the very interesting thing is that all the options that has to be given to the customer for the consent withdrawal and eraser, right? So you need to have your own portal where that customer can come. Maybe it could be the website, it could be your mobile app platforms, and customer can come and consent. But yes, if the customer is trying to withdraw the consent, you need to figure it out that he is ceased to avail the services. Like he can't be a situation that he has given the consent and say for the health insurance, but he withdraw the consent and he continue to have the health insurance. It may not be there, right? So that has been defined properly. Yes, if he comes back and say that I don't want you to use my data for the marketing analytics, then you will have to stop. So that will be there, and then entire the data localization, cross-border transfers, that you need to be very clear that where the data is getting transferred. If you are using the cloud, then primarily you need to figure it out that cloud is that India-based centers, like even that not only the production but the DR site as well. So just I will touch upon a few of the elements as we go about.
Sorry, I have a question here. Sorry.
Yes, please.
Yeah. So in terms of purpose limitation, in terms of enforcing that, so are there? I'm sure it's still new, so there are not many guidelines. But are there any benchmarks or any best practices in terms of maintaining audit logs? So for example, if I'm going to process that information for a particular purpose, do I create an audit trail that this data was used on this date for this purpose? That would be, I would assume, one of the requirements, right?
Absolutely. I think that's right. So since we are running on that time, but this is where, like, whenever that you collect the data, that consent, when it has been captured in your audit trails or in your consent database, it has to very clearly map that what is the purpose that you have collected this data with the timestamp and everything, right? And that's where the role of the consent manager comes, which is primarily you may not store the everything in your own databases because you may be multiple databases where that your data may flow. So you need to have one third-party interface which is coming, which is embedded into Journey, and every time you're collecting the data, it gets stored there with a very clearly mapped to the purpose so that you can establish the fact that this data was collected for this purpose only. So yes, that's going to be the design of that technology's enablement that if you talk about it. Yes, sir.
Hello. My question is in terms of division of responsibility when the data breach occurs between a fiduciary and the processor. Because processor will always point at fiduciary and the way around. So, and the penalty is quite steep, 250 crores. So yeah, there has to be some mechanism to divide this extent of breach between fiduciary and processor, I guess.
So that's where the contract comes into the picture. Now every contract between data fiduciary and the processor, you may need to pass on that some other risk, right? In case the breach has happened at the data process. One, that definitely you need to have the strong technology mechanism established to prove that the data breach or the data misuse has happened, right? But the contractually you will need to address that.
Precisely. So is there any certification saying that this particular processor, if you do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, then you are good to go? Because there has to be some certification, otherwise it's difficult to pinpoint.
You're right, right? So far, at least in the Act draft rules also, there's not main mechanism for the certification, right? It's primarily emphasized on the self-certification process, right? So for like example, significant data fiduciary, it's talk about the data privacy impact assessment. So not only you do your privacy impact assessment for yourself, but all the processor involved, like what the data is processor, how the security measures has been deployed at the processor end and all this. So it's more on the self-certification mechanism, not as a third-party self-certification. And also, is my understanding, and I will be happy to be corrected, the way you see in the banking and the insurance, the regulators typically drive the agenda of any act implementation. Like say, for example, PMLA, if you look at it, the RBI and the IRDA will come back with this guideline and they will continue to do an audit with respect to the. I'm expecting that the same will happen in here also, where the IRDA will say they already released the security standards and they keep on checking your security standards against those guidelines which has been released by IRDA. I'm expecting that that's the same will happen as soon as the implementation guidelines get released. RBI and IRDA may come with its own guidelines that how the banks or the insurance should follow.
One last question.
Yeah.
Once you anonymize the data, does it immediately come out of the purview of DPDP?
Yes, at least as far that act is there and the implementation draft guidelines has come, if the data is anonymized and that has been used or shared among that, and you are not able to establish the identity of the data principal, it's excluded.
Thank you.
And one question was that, is this enforced? Not yet. We are waiting for the implementation guidelines to come from the government, which will be primarily telling that what is the timeline, who data protection board will be constituted, right? Those are the things yet to happen. Then enforcement will happen. And I think it is also expected that timelines will be given. Now the question is that how long the timelines, because when the act was passed, it was expected that 1.5 years or 2 years will be given for the implementation. But the draft guidelines, act is already there for the almost 2 years now, right? So whether now we will get the 2 years or 1 year or 6 months, we'll have to wait and watch. I think some of the scenarios, if you look at it, like, so for example, when you are talking about that users-based and IoT, so far we have been collecting the data which is very much personal in nature, but now the more data is getting generated in the process, be it on the telematics, be it on the health wearables, and these are your own set of the data, right? It's your data, right? How you're driving, how much you're driving, right? So how is your health and all the count. Now that data is also going to be available which you can see that different kind of the data elements will get generated. Now taking a consent for that, ensuring the protection of these data and all these things will be very critical. And what kind of the challenges that you will have, that how you are going to extend the purpose to the customers, right? Say for example, you are giving a policy of the paper as you drive. Now you have to tell the customer that these telematics, the data that you are going to collect will be used to define that your driving behavior, which will link to your pricing and the premiums, right? So that's where that you will have to give that kind of the clarity, and you can't use the telematics data for some other purpose, right? Or the consent confusion, customer may not get the complete clarity that, okay, how he is giving the consent. Today also most of the customer may not have that kind of the clarity, right? It will be your responsibility to make sure the customer is very clear about that what consent he is giving and how you're going to take care of the consent part of it. Third-party dependency, a lot of the dependency will continue to grow upon the third parties, right? Where the telematics data will be used or the wearable data will be used between the hospitals, between the TPAs, profiling without transparency. I think data storage risk. Now so much of the data which will get generated and also on the real-time basis, then you will have a real massive headache that how you're going to manage those and store these data. And another scenario, again, the same case, we will have the embedded finance, which is already getting popular. Their platforms are being used for the distribution of the policy. Many of the challenge, and there also the lots of the data gets exchanged between the parties, right? Okay, let me know whenever, Srikanth, that I need to take a pause. Okay. So here also the privacy risk going to be there. Like, so for example, when the bundled consents are there, is the customer going to aware that at the Amazon, if he is buying the insurance, with whom that he is buying the insurance, for what purpose that the insurance is getting bought? So he may not have that kind of the clarity. So you may need to take care of that wherever you are bundling the consent, blurring of the roles, right? Who is the data fiduciary, right? Who is the data processor? Is the Amazon data processor, or is it that insurance company gonna be the processor, right? Then opt-in out situation, audit gaps. So Amazon may have, as I was talking about, Amazon may have that some logs that, okay, he has given the consent, but that consent has been passed as a data points to the insurance companies, right? Those are the challenges that you will see. I think I'll skip, I think more or less. So some of the challenges, I think most of the things I have already spoken, but third-party breaches, that's primarily, as we were talking about, that data fiduciary may have all set of the controls, right? But at the data processor end, it could be your tech platforms partner, it could be aggregator, it could be the hospitals, it could be the TPAs, it could be the brokers, right? So many of the places, they may be using the cloud-based infrastructure, they may have their own set of the security controls. Some of them may have the certification, some of them may not have the certification. So there that you have a high chances of the data breaches, and how you're going to protect of these data breaches at the third party end, right? And that's where it comes of that especially on the significant data fiduciary case, like say, for example, largely that potential that insurance companies will fall into that. You will have to do the data audit up for, not for yourself, but also all the third party that you are working with you. Then consent design, as we were talking about, like how you're going to define the purpose, how you're going to define that consent flow in the journeys, and every stage of the consent. Because during the journeys, you may be taking on multiple points where the different consents are taken for different set of the data. You can't have the bundling, right? So that's where that entire the design has to be laid down, and also ensuring that you are not undermining that entire the customer experience. So that will be your challenges. Data misuse risk could be there now, since you are not only using that entire the personal and KYC data, but the large set of the data, right? So those are the challenges will be there. And the logs for fragmented consent logs that I've been talking about. So far, if you look at it, in the current environment, largely there are chances that your tech platforms may not be capturing that consent in their databases. Yes, it might be there somewhere in the logs, right? But it may not be there in your systems. So how do you going to figure it out? And not only in your system, but all the touch point of this, wherever the customer is getting engaged in the process. So some of this, again, control measure, and again, I'm talking about 30 minutes is not short. Typically, I've taken a 3 to 4 hours of the master class on the DPDPA, but just try to touch upon some of this aspect. So look at that in the third party, how the third party, what are the things that you can do that as a data fiduciary. If many of you will be data fiduciary, and many of you may be the data processor also, either providing the tech platforms or either providing, acting as a partner to the data fiduciary. You need to take care of the certain controls because you need to support the data fiduciary. So if he is gonna get fined, chances are very high that he will be passing on some of the fines to you. 250 crore is not an easy thing. Okay. So primarily data processing agreement, you need to have very strong agreement in place with the clauses on the security, right uses of the consent, right uses of the notices. Now look at that. If the customer is on Amazon platforms, he gives you the data, then at the same time, at this stage itself, the consent need to be passed on to the data fiduciary, and the notice has to go from the data fiduciary, right? So those are all the aspect has to be put in the agreement, and how you are going to use the data. In case the data processor is going to share with some third party, like a subcontractor, then at that stage also you need to be very careful about that all the contractual arrangement have been put in place. Then vendor privacy audits, as I was talking about, that you may have to create a checklist, you may have to do for the audits, going in-person audits, because it's going to be very critical, right? Then entire the governance structure, having a regular review mechanism with that. Every time, whenever the partner is making a change in the journey process, it is in complete consent with the data fiduciary, or data fiduciary has completely control over the end-to-end journey part of it, right? So these are the things that you have to ensure. Then entire controls with encryption. And encryption not only in the data which is getting stored, the encryption also in the whole process where the data flows from one point to the other points. So if the data is flowing at the Amazons, not only Amazon need to store that encrypted data, but also where the data is moving. So entire that flow of the data, that encryption should be there, access control should be there. Yeah, perfect. So almost I'm through. So this is there, same way that the bank insurance, where the banks become a distributor, they will take care of that entire process, but all the consent mechanism, transparency, keeping records, data fiduciary, and self-service privacy tools, that need to be taken care. How do you know about? Typically the 5-phase process that now the implementation guidelines has yet to come about, right? But there are certain things that you can get started because it's already there. It's round the corner for the implementation. As I was talking about, we don't know that how much time that you are going to get. So I think some of the things that you need to start that first understand that what are the data is getting collected at your own platform, all your interfaces, third-party interfaces, how the entire the journey is there, where the consents are being taken, where the data are getting stored, all the aspects that you figure it out, and at least you will have the complete view of the data, right? And the consent and the notices. So you know that where to touch upon. When it comes as implementation, where do you need to touch upon? Perform the data protection impact assessment. As I talked about that you may be working with the loss of the third parties. So you need to figure it out that what are my risks are there and what are the control measures that I need to take. You have the clarity, build all the policies, control and everything, and then go about the implementation of the consent management. That's where primarily you may hold, because yet to get the clarity on the consent management platforms, that who will be the consent management platforms. That time, that primarily, by the time you will do this phase 1 to 3, it will already be some time because it's not an easy exercise for any data fiduciary or data processor to do the exercise, right? So with that, I'll take a pause. I think, so we'll get started with our sessions. All the best. And thank you guys. Thank you for being good listeners. Thank you guys.